Hi, and welcome back to the channel. And what we're going to do today is we're going to try and upgrade this Dell E520 PC. The reason why we want to do this was we found it on the side of a street, on a curbside with its side off actually. My wife found it about a year ago. When I got it home, I put it under the desk over there and I wasn't really that interested in it. But recently I came across this game, Temple of Elemental Evil, by a company called Troika. And one of the lead developers of Troika is Timothy Kane, and he was actually the lead developer on Fallout. So there's a bit of a sort of chain of interest there for myself anyway. And because of that game, I thought to myself, it would be really nice if I could get myself a really good Windows XP sort of era machine. So I decided to get that machine from out under the desk, get it up here and have a look inside. When I looked inside, I could see that there wasn't a cooler. I was missing this cooler. So I had to get that ordered. And I found that after working out that it was working, I then found out that it had a very basic CPU. So I knew that I had to upgrade a number of components to get it to the point where, you know, I was happy to use it for gaming from, say, 2000 to maybe 2010. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to upgrade a number of components, actually 5 components, to get this machine up to the sort of standard that we're going to need for its use case. Now, we're going to make this a little bit more fun because I'm going to try and award myself achievements for each one of these elements. So those achievements are going to come in the form of badges. So we have 5 elements to upgrade. So they are the hard disk. Right now, it has a spinning hard disk in it, and we need to get rid of that because, number one, it will probably die at some point. They don't last forever, spinning hard disks, and they are relatively hot and they make a noise, etc., etc. So we're going to try and upgrade that to an SSD. Then we have the RAM. Right now, it has ½ GB of RAM in it, which is nowhere near the maximum this machine can actually fit. With a BIOS upgrade, it can actually fit 8 GB of RAM, so that's 16 times as much the memory. So that's something we're going to take a look at. Then the graphics card. I bought this card. It's an Asus 8800 GT. We're going to take a look at if we can actually use this in the machine or if there's something else that we might have to use. One of the problems about the machine is it does have a very limited space for the graphics card. So yeah, it's in the balance really whether that can actually be used. Then we've got the CPU. A big aspect of the speed of this machine is obviously the CPU. Right now it's got a 1.86 gigahertz Core 2 Duo. So got 2 cores, which is kind of interesting that, you know, we're at the era where we're starting to see multiple cores in our machines. We're going to try and get it up to a faster Core 2 Duo or potentially even a quad-core CPU. So we'll just have to see how things turn out in that regard. Then, of course, the cooler for the CPU has to be changed because potentially we may need to have a better cooler if we do manage to get this machine to use a newer CPU, say with 4 cores and possibly overclocked, then the cooler will really come into it. Even maybe with a quad-core, standard quad-core, maybe the cooler does need to be upgraded. So for each of these 5 points, I'm going to award myself a badge, and it's either going to be bronze, silver, or a gold badge, depending on how things turn out. I'm aiming to get gold in every one of those, but we never know. So I'll be honest, you know, if I don't quite achieve my maximum goal, then I'll give myself a silver or bronze. So yeah, there's a little bit of peril. We'll have to see how that turns out. Now, there is one other limit to all of this, which is that I set myself a limit of £35 per component that goes into this machine. It doesn't mean that I can't have multiple. So for instance, we're probably going to try out multiple CPUs. CPUs actually turned out to be one of the cheapest elements in this PC. Most of them were coming in at between £6 and £10. So they're way under our budget. But the one thing I would say that was close to the budget would be the graphics cards. I believe this one was £19, so obviously very, very cheap. But yeah, anything that goes into this machine must cost on its own no more than £35. So that's the goal. 5 upgrades, and we must achieve a budget of gold. If we were to put anything over the £35, we would only get a budget of silver. So that's the kind of criteria that I'm setting for myself. There's only one thing that remains to be done before we actually crack on with those upgrades, and that is the chipset drivers and the graphics card driver. In the previous video in this series, we did actually get this machine working. It boots, and we managed to get a graphics card into it when it was found it had no graphics card. The graphics card that it would have had would have been I believe it was an NVIDIA 7300 LE Pretty basic card really, so don't think we're going to have any trouble exceeding that. But whatever we have in there has to have the proper NVIDIA drivers and also has to have the chipset drivers, network driver, etc., etc. So let's get on with that, and fingers crossed we can get gold in every one of the achievements. So before we can move on to the main tasks in this video, I obviously had to get certain drivers and the BIOS updated and bits and bobs like that. So the first thing I had to look at was trying to install the new BIOS. So I think it was in 2007 that Dell released a new BIOS, version 2.4, and that actually updated the capabilities of the machine quite substantially. So we had to get that installed. So I tried installing that, and that just wouldn't work. I know that was a way to do it without actually being in the OS, but from within the OS, within XP, it just wouldn't install it. I did actually try twice. So I decided to move on and not dwell on it too much. Maybe it needed something in the chipset drivers. Maybe that was the issue. So I decided next to try and get the chipset drivers installed. That went ahead very easily. Basically clicked on the file, extracted the files, installed the chipset drivers. Everything went well with that. Now the chipset drivers are very important. They're basically the glue that runs the main chipset that connects together the CPU with the RAM and the BIOS and basically everything. So if you don't have the correct chipset and drivers installed, you can find that the machine will have bugs and certain capabilities won't be working correctly, so on and so forth. So that was a pretty key driver to get out of the way. When that was done, the machine rebooted. And after the reboot, I then went on to install the network drivers. Once I got that done, I then installed the Intel Matrix Storage Manager. And those are a set of drivers for basically the hard disk, the SATA drivers and things like that. It also would enable us to use RAID if we wanted to, although I believe this machine only offers RAID 1, which I don't really need. But anyway, it's a very good idea to have the latest drivers for the hard disk, obviously, to get, for instance, the best performance out of it. So we got those installed. Once that was finished, we had to do another reboot. And after the reboot, for the first time, I could actually see that the network was working for the first time. I could actually see the Ethernet properties. Not something I'm going to set up right now, so we'll come back to that in another video down the line. So yeah, that was great. Then I attempted to flash the BIOS again, now that I had the chipset drivers installed and we'd rebooted. This time it went ahead perfectly. I just let it carry on, made sure I didn't get in the way of it. And after a reboot, I went into the BIOS and checked the version, and we were now on version 2.4. So with all that out of the way, what we had to do next was get the graphics card drivers installed. So I did some research and found that the version that I needed was version 368.81. Downloaded that, tried to install it. It didn't work because it said that I had to have a component from .NET, an imaging component, whatever that was for. So I went on the internet, downloaded that, installed it, tried installing the drivers again. And this time it informed me that it couldn't install because I didn't have XP Service Pack 3 installed. XP Service Pack 3 would obviously have a number of bug fixes for XP. It'd be a very good idea to have it to basically get it up to the latest and greatest for XP. So I downloaded an ISO for Windows XP Service Pack 3, installed that. That took quite a long time. I also had some blue screens in the middle of the installation, which was a bit nerve-wracking, to be honest. But after the machine rebooted, the installation actually carried on okay. So that wasn't a problem in the long term. That installation eventually completed, and once that was done, I then recommenced trying to install the NVIDIA drivers again, and this time it went ahead very easily. The drivers were installed, and now we had a graphics card that was firing on all cylinders. And you could see this by the fact, for instance, that in the higher resolution that I was using, I could move a window around inside Windows, and it didn't chug and lag, so I could see that the windowing system was working really quickly. So with all of that done, we are now ready to move on to the next stage and start upgrading hardware. So with the chipset drivers and Windows XP, Service Pack 3 and the graphics drivers installed, the next thing that we need to do is to actually benchmark the machine, benchmark the graphics card and the CPU and all that kind of stuff, so that later on in this video I can actually quantify just how much of an improvement we have in this machine. So I did a little bit of research and I found out that 3D Mark was, even back then, you know, the go-to. And I found 3D Mark 06, which I believe came out in 2006. So it sounds about slap bang in the range where we wanted to do some benchmarking. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to install it, and then I'm going to benchmark our E6300 chip. That's the chip which came with the machine, the Core 2 Duo running at 1.86 gigahertz. So that's going to be our baseline We have the original RAM, which is running at the base speed, so it's not even the fastest RAM that you can get. And it turns out that later on you could get even faster RAM than that, running at 800 megahertz. That's actually due to arrive maybe tomorrow, so hopefully we can get that installed and give that a go. But anyway, for now we need to get this installed and see what this gives us. So 3D Mark has a number of different benchmarks. Some of them are aimed solely at graphics. So for instance, Procyon, that one is a graphics benchmark, and yeah, it's relatively complex as well. So that, you know, there may be some CPU element of that as well. And I found that on my machine as it is right now, it actually played back pretty well. Once that's finished, it goes on to another graphics benchmark, Firefly Forest, which to me seems to be a simpler example, although I guess there's a lot of transparency going on in the foliage in this particular example. A couple of will-o'-the-wisps flying around in a magical forest. And then it has a CPU test. And every time I've seen this running, my machine seems to go into an absolute crawl. I'm talking about 0 frames per second. Yeah, it seems to wibble out between 0 and 1 frame per second. So basically, the CPU in this machine is just not handling this at all. I'm assuming that this benchmark can do multiple processors. So I'll be interested to see what happens when we install a faster processor, how much of a difference it makes to this particular benchmark. Then it loads up another benchmark, again, another CPU test. And again, the performance is absolutely awful. Then we have Canyon Flight, which is quite nice, sort of a dirigible flying through a canyon. And then it kind of gets into some kind of tangle with this aquatic dragon, which I must admit looks to me like it would absolutely trounce the dirigible. So I don't understand quite what's going on here, why they thought they would get into a fight with it. And I've not noticed it before now, but it does actually seem to have some kind of translucency effects on the dragon, which is quite nice. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And then there's Deep Freeze, which is another graphics test. So as you can see, mostly this benchmark suite focuses on graphics tests. Anyway, all of that stuff run through, and at the end of it, it came out with a score. And right now we have 8,918 3D marks. Well, anyway, with that out of the way, let's do a Quake benchmark. And I think once we've got that done, we will then move on to actually upgrading the machine slowly. So one of the benchmarks that I want to do is Quake 3 Arena. It's a bit early really for this rig, but it's a real game and you can benchmark it. So I think it's actually worth doing it rather than it being, you know, everything being synthetic. So let's open it up. There we go. And we just need to type in here time demo 1. Let's see what we get. So now we have to choose a time demo. So I'm going to go for this one. This is actually an artificially produced level for NVIDIA. It was a demo back in the day to show off, you know, how nice Quake 3 was, I guess. Some kind of tie-in with NVIDIA. And because of that, it's actually quite heavy on the polygons, which makes it a good use case for a demo. So when I press play on this, it's going to look a bit weird. It's not going to be playing the way you would expect it. It's going to play extremely quickly. And then it's going to come back with a report on the frame rate in the console, as we saw just now when I opened it up. So anyway, let's just press play. It's going to load it up. And yeah, like I said, it's a bit crazy. Not something you can really watch. Yeah, it's just playing through basically the recording of all the characters' positions and then using that to benchmark the frame rate that it can manage. And that's it. Let's open up the console. And it says here that it did 1,508 frames in 15 seconds. So the speed was 100.2 FPS. There we are. Now we have our Quake benchmark to come back to and have a look at later once we upgrade the machine a little. So before we move on, we have one last benchmark that we need to do, and that's Cinebench 11.5. The reason why I want to do this is because I want to have a pure CPU benchmark, and this will give it. It uses ray tracing, including blurry reflections, and that does tend to stress out the CPU somewhat. So yeah, we can use this as our benchmark. I'm going to run the benchmark 3 times, and the reason for that is because I want to see if I have a consistent score, and I also want to see what the temperature is of the cores at the end of the 3 tests. Obviously, running it 3 times in a row would stress it. When I worked in VFX, it would be very common to render maybe 200, 300 images in a row, and the machine might have to run for sometimes 2 days to do that. And therefore a cooler was very important. Now, in this case, the reason why I'm doing this is because a little bit later on in this video, we're going to be looking at the cooling performance of the 2 coolers that I have. I've got the original aluminium cooler that came with this machine, obviously a lower end cooler. And then we also have the copper heat pipe, which is currently installed. Honestly, for this particular test, I think the copper heat pipe is just going to find this very, very easy. This is a lower clock speed CPU compared to some of the ones we'll be looking at later, and it only has 2 cores. One of the chips we're going to look at later has 4 cores. More cores equals more heat. That out of the way, let's run it. As I said, I'm going to run it 3 times. We'll take the average of the 3 scores, and also we'll make a record of the temperature so we can check out those coolers later. So there's the temperature recording software. And you can see down the bottom there, it shows you the 2 cores, the current temperature right now. Let's click on run. Let's just let that go. When it's run 3 times, as I said, we'll take an average of the 3 scores. So in this case, I saw temps of 50 degrees on one core and 48 on the other, and the end score was 1.01. However, I then went on to run it 3 more times, and I got an average score of 1.02. So that's what we will go on with for later. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's move on. The first thing we're going to look at in terms of upgrading is the hard drive. And I must admit, I had to jump the gun a little bit on this. The hard drive actually got upgraded in the last video. And the reason for that was we had to have something to install the operating system on. Otherwise, we couldn't install the drivers and do all the other benchmarks. Yeah, you see what I mean? It's a bit of a sort of chicken and an egg situation. Anyway, so what have we done? Well, originally we had a SATA hard drive, 240 gig, spinning Rust drive, perfectly adequate for the time. But a few years later, it became more common to get SSD drives. So what I have here is a Kingston 480 gigabyte SSD drive. So twice the capacity. It is way, way faster. It is silent. It doesn't produce much heat at all. What else can I say about it? Yeah, better capacity, silent, no heat, and it's very, very fast. How fast? Well, I did a sort of basic benchmark. What I did was I booted up the machine until it got to the XP desktop, and that was my basic benchmark. And I did that with the upgraded drive, and it currently takes 20 seconds. That's kind of representative because that's actually with software, drivers, etc., installed. So it's representative of a real install. And then I also went back and installed the original hard drive here and booted from that. And what was interesting was that sometimes it wouldn't actually boot up, which I couldn't quite understand. It would literally, you could hear the drive chuntling away, but there were no graphics. And you would reboot the machine, the same thing, reboot the machine, same thing. But interestingly, as soon as I reinstalled the upgraded drive, it would boot every single time. So I really don't understand what that was all about. But anyway, it took 47 seconds to boot, which is obviously over twice as long. So this hard drive is pretty much at least twice as fast, silent, less heat, better capacity as well. So I think based on all of those criteria, the only award I can really give myself is the gold achievement. So yeah, I think we've done really, really well with the hard drive. And I've got to say, it makes a world of difference to the performance of this machine. I think today, in the modern era with M.2 drives and all that kind of stuff, we've forgotten just how fast these modern drives are. And the SSD doesn't get us as fast as a modern drive, but it does get us a lot faster than this drive from, when was it, 2006, something like that. So yeah, really, really happy with this upgrade. And it does give us a fantastic foundation for the rest of the machine to be built on. So I've been waiting for this about, I don't know, 10 days, 11 days, something like that. Ordered it from China and it's just arrived. So this is 800 megahertz RAM. Interestingly, if we have a look on CPU Z here, it says that the current RAM in the machine is 266 megahertz, but I know that it's actually stated to be 533, which is double that speed. So I'm guessing it's clock double to that speed. So yeah, this RAM would, I guess, using this schema, show up as 400 megahertz, but it actually runs at 800 megahertz. That is if it actually works in this machine. I think this is going to have a big impact on the machine, how it performs. However, it may not have that much of an impact right now with the base CPU in, which is what we have. So we're going to have to replace that with a faster CPU, probably to take advantage of this RAM. But it's probably the easiest upgrade that we can do. So let's get it done first. So let's just turn off the machine. Just wait for it to shut down. There we go. So let's take out the RAM. So it looks like it's the third socket in and the first socket, which the RAM should go into. So let's stick with that to start off with. Much bigger these units are. Look at the size of these sticks compared to these. These are actually quite tiny. Let's grab two of these and I think get them in the right orientation. I think it's this way. Let's have a look. No, it's the other way. PC 6400, 2 gigabytes. The other big difference is the amount of RAM that this should hopefully give us is going to be 8 gigabytes if all 4 sticks work, or 4 gigabytes if only 2 work, and even that is 4 times as much RAM as we have right now. So let's pop that in there. There we are. Okay, that's seated well. Let's try turning on the machine. See what happens, fingers crossed. Oh, good. To be honest, I was expecting some bleeps. So far, F1 key to continue. What is this saying? I can't quite see that from here. The amount of system memory has changed. That's expected. Yeah, carry on. So let's have a look at CPU Z, and then we'll install the rest of the sticks, assuming that those two are working perfectly fine. Let's have a look at memory. Yeah, DDR2, 4 gigabytes. And the speed is showing up as 400. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so that looks good. So let's just shut down the machine again and we'll get the full 4 gigabytes installed. So let's just wait for a few seconds. Great. So yeah, this basically now means that this machine has 8 times as much RAM as it had back in the day. So let's have a look at CPU Z to just verify that. Yeah, that's pretty cool, isn't it? Look at that. Not only is it 8 times as much RAM, but the speed is also now 800 megahertz instead of, what was it, 533. So that's 30% or more speed increase. So what I'll do is I'll give this a quick benchmark for a couple of reasons. Number one, does the RAM work okay? Number two, has it made any difference? It'll be interesting to see if we run 3D Mark, how much of a difference we get with the benchmark. Okay, so with the 800 megahertz memory, let's have a look what Quake 3 Arena comes out like. Let's just put it into time demo mode. There we are. And again, it's going to be the crazy moment, so we'll just skip past this. And the result on this occasion is 103.9. Okay, nearly 4%. That's pretty good. And then I rolled on to running the 3D Mark, and as you can see here, the score was 9,011 points. So I worked out the difference between that and the base score, and it's just 1% actually in this case, which is interesting that it's noticeably lower than the Quake Mark, but it is what it is. Great, so we've got our new memory in, and that gives us 8 gigabytes, which is fantastic. It was half a gigabyte before. Now we're up to 8 gigabytes, which is great. Any games that come a little bit later for this machine will work in it a lot better. So this pushes the capabilities of this machine into the future. The clock speed as well on the original memory was, 533? Now it's 800 megahertz, and that's, believe it or not, 50% faster. So that will make a difference to games, and not necessarily right now. As we saw, the benchmark showed that Quake, it was only 3% for Quake, which is actually not too bad. But then for 3D Mark, it was only 1%. Not quite sure why the disparity between the two. Obviously, Quake is closer to, it's a real benchmark. It's not synthetic. 3D Mark is a little bit more synthetic, let's put it that way. Not that synthetic, because obviously it's rendering a bunch of 3D scenes, but it probably has less game logic going on, let's put it that way, than, let's say, Quake. So I think that 800 megahertz is going to come into play a little bit later when we start to try and overclock the machine, because if we do push it, if we can actually manage to push it to, say, 3 gigahertz, 3.3 gigahertz, then at that point, the original memory probably would have been a bit of a bottleneck, and now it won't be because we've got this faster RAM in there. So definitely worth upgrading that. So great, the memory upgrade on this machine went really well, I think. I managed to find the fastest RAM that you could possibly get for this machine, and I also managed to get the maximum capacity. So I think, it's fair to say that I deserve the gold award, I think, the gold achievement for this. So yeah, I'm going to give myself the gold award for the RAM. Didn't really have that much of an effect on the speed of the machine so far, but hopefully later on in this video, it will give some uplift to the CPUs when they install those. But yeah, I'm very happy with the RAM. Gold achievement there. The next thing that we're going to look at is the graphics card. Now the graphics card, unfortunately, again, was upgraded in the last video, and it was for exactly the same reason actually as the hard disk, which is that I can't use the machine if it doesn't have a graphics card. So when this machine was found on the curbside, it actually had no graphics card and it had no heatsink, although oddly the CPU was actually left in place. So there's an interesting history there going on with the machine. It was probably stripped, I assume, for use in later machines. Anyway, I had to buy a graphics card, and I actually bought this one. It's an Asus 8800 GTX. But I did do a little bit of research into what was probably in this machine. I had a look through the Dell website's drivers when I was installing the chipset drivers for this machine. And I did find one graphics card driver, and it was for a GeForce 7300 LE. And it was a pretty basic card. You can imagine that when you buy one of these more sort of commodity machines, you're not necessarily going to get the best graphics card in the world. I guess that would fall to the Alienware machines that Dell, I'm not sure if they purchased Alienware at this point, but you know, that's the kind of niche where the best graphics cards would go into. Yeah, so, you know, it kind of makes sense that more of a sort of commodity graphics card would go into this machine. I did manage to track down the 3D Mark 2006 score for that particular graphics card, and it was 1006. So by today's standards, that's pretty paltry, but you know, as I said, that was kind of like the graphics card that you had in the machine at the time. So as I said, this was the graphics card that was going to go into the machine, an Asus 8800 GTX, pretty powerful card. This one had a 3D Mark of 13,000. Yeah, 13,646 compared to just over 1,000 for the original card. So this would have been an absolute monster. But the problem is it's a very big card. And what I didn't really take into account was that the cooler in this machine is so massive that I couldn't actually fit this into the machine. So I had to abandon plans to put this into this machine. Anyway, from that cloud, there came a silver lining. And it came in the shape of this card, which is a Zotac 750 Ti. This graphics card is actually 6 years younger than this card, which is pretty amazing. And it's a completely different generation of hardware. And one of the big benefits of this card over this card, as you can see, is it's so much smaller, it uses less power, and it's more powerful. So I did find a 3D Mark for this, which was 20,000, so 7,000 more than this. But I don't think we'll necessarily get that in this machine. And the reason for that is that 3D Mark that I found was with a later generation of CPU. And part of 3D Mark 06 is it actually has a CPU test. So it's not a pure graphics card test. It does have some CPU mixed in with it. So it's hard to disentangle things completely. So we'll see later just how fast this is with the GPU that we actually do end up putting into this machine. But it shows that this card is superior to this one. Less power, shorter, so we'll actually physically fit in the machine. And it's actually more powerful. So what can we say? Do you think we should get a silver, maybe, or a gold? Well, I think, you know, this is literally the fastest card you could put in this machine, and it's going to give us really a fantastic benchmark, I think, later on. So provisionally, I think I'll give myself a gold achievement, but we'll have to see later in this video if that pans out. Even if it isn't as fast as the 20,000 points that we get there, if it is faster than the 13,600 that we have here, showing for this card, I think the gold achievement will stick. So yeah, I think it's a gold achievement for the graphics card. So that out of the way, let's now think about overclocking the machine. So I've got all these little jiffy bags here. I'll show you some stats for these on screen as I hold it up, because it's not going to be very easy to read these from there. I've got these as basically to keep the CPU safe when I'm not using them. And this bag is for the Core 2 Duo when it comes out. So this is the original chip, the E6300, which runs at 1.86 gigahertz. It's a Core 2 Duo chip, and it's from July 2006. That's why, you know, I've basically aged this machine as being bought in 2006, because this chip didn't exist until then. So pretty much that ages it pretty well. So we're going to be replacing this. And if we go in order of release date, the next chip that we could look at would be the Intel quad core. It's a Q6700. As I said, it's a quad core CPU, and it runs at 2.66 gigahertz. So substantially faster than the original chip, obviously with 4 cores instead of 2. And this one was released in April of 2007. I don't know if it's going to work in this machine. I've seen that the Q6600 works in this machine, but I haven't heard anybody mention this one in particular. So it'll be interesting to see if this works. Next up, we have the chip that I would really like to, I'd like the quad core to work. Obviously, it'd be interesting to find out what that performs like. But obviously this one, which is a Core 2 Duo E6300, which runs at 3.33 gigahertz. Yeah, very, very fast. This was released in August of 2008, nearly 2009. So nearly 3 years from the release of this machine. So it'll be interesting to see if this works. But this is the fastest Core 2 Duo chip that was released as far as I understand it. It'll be very interesting to see how fast this is. Yeah, that'll be cool. Okay, now we are actually in 2009 and we have another Core 2 Duo. I'm not sure really if I would ever use this, but I'll try it anyway. It's an E7500 and it runs at 2.95 gigahertz. So again, pushing the barriers of 3 gigahertz, but not quite. But this is from January 2009, so it's even newer than the previous chip. So it'll be interesting to see if this works. You never know. And then finally, and this is a bit of a weird one, I must admit I made a mistake with this. This is a Pentium E6700. And when I actually ordered this, I misread this and I thought it said Core 2 Duo. I don't know, I just read it and I saw the number, which I must admit is very similar to like an E6300 and things like that. But it turns out it's from a different range of chips, which came, by the looks of it, after the Core 2 Duo chips. This one runs at 3.2 gigahertz, but it is from May 2010. So substantially newer than this machine. So yeah, I'm not really sure if this is going to work in it, but we'll give it a go. That's all we can do really. So let's not hang around. Let's crack on and try putting in the first chip. But before we do that, let's have a quick word from our sponsor, JustWay, the easiest way to custom parts. JustWay offer CNC machining, 3D printing, injection molding and sheet metal manufacture. Just go to the JustWay website, define your project and get an instant quote. It really is that easy. So remember, head over to JustWay to get your project manufactured just the way you want. Okay, great. Well, there is the original chip from this machine. As I said earlier, it's a Core 2 Duo E6300 1.86 gigahertz, and this was released in July of 2006, which very firmly dates this machine. There's been a little bit of confusion about exactly when it was released. As I said, it was maybe 2004, 2005. I think it was released back then, but it had a relatively long life. So this particular one was sold in at least 2006 because it has that chip in it. I'm assuming it wasn't upgraded. I believe that was one of the standard chips you could actually get with this machine. Anyway, that's out. This is in an Intel Q6700, the Q meaning quad core. This particular quad core is running at 2.66 gigahertz. So obviously faster than that chip there, just based on the gigahertz speed, substantially faster. And this one was released in April of 2007, so just about pretty much a year later. So let's see what happens when we try and boot it up. Okay, that's good. Excellent. It boots up. Let's give it some benchmarking. I've got to make sure, obviously, the heatsink is actually installed correctly because I'm not actually screwing it down, but it's got quite a lot of weight on it. The copper heatsink is pretty heavy and is pushing down onto the thermal grease, so it should be okay. So first of all, let's just try Quake Arena. So let's go for time demo. Okay. And wow, look at that, 150 FPS. So 50% faster than the original chip. You know, that's pretty good. I'm not sure how much of that is the quad core. I know that Quake, this is the third version of Quake Arena. I believe by now it's already automatically got symmetric multiprocessing turned on, which basically means it uses more than one core, which was a relatively new thing at this time. Not many games actually made use of multiple cores. So it was quite a fancy thing that Quake did that. Written by John Carmack, so you can imagine that would have been the kind of thing that John Carmack would do. Okay, let's quit out of here. And next what we're going to do is we're going to do 3D Mark. Now, that actually takes quite a while, so I'll just have to leave it running and we'll come back at the end and we'll see what that looks like. Now, of course, this particular CPU has 4 megabytes of cache as well, so that's going to make a big difference, not just the clock speed. So let's run this. Wow, I mean, look at that. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? 15274 compared to the original 8918. I've worked it out here and it's 71% faster. And that compares to Quake 3 Arena coming out as 49, basically 50% faster. I'm not sure why there is a difference. Maybe the benchmark here makes more use of the extra cores. Hard to tell really, but anyway, you can see that between them, there's a pretty impressive uplift. What we're going to do next is we're going to go back to a Core 2 chip. So this will be interesting. This is the Core 2 Duo E600. And this one runs at 3.3 gigahertz. Apparently this is the fastest Core 2 Duo that was made. And this was released in August of 2008, so 2 years after this machine was originally sold. So give me a second, we'll put this in and I'll put the quad core chip over there safe, and then we'll give this a go and see if this can give this chip a run for its money. Okay, well the quad core chip is out. And this chip is in its place, the Core 2 Duo E600 3300 gigahertz. And let's see what happens when we turn it on. I've made sure that the cooler's in and seated on it nicely. Nothing much so far. You can hear the cooler getting a little bit noisy. So yeah, it doesn't look like a good sign, does it? Either that is an X CPU, it doesn't work anymore, or it is just not compatible with this logic board. So unfortunately, it looks like the fastest Core 2 Duo that was produced just doesn't work with this machine. Now, what's a little bit worrying is the next chip that I have is another Core 2 Duo, and oddly, it is actually from a little bit later, and it's actually slower than this one. So I would imagine it's not going to work. I mean, if this one from 2008 doesn't work, a chip from, I think, 2009 is not going to work either. Anyway, let's give it a go. Great, so we've got the next chip in, and it is a Core 2 Duo E6500, released in January of 2009, so 3 years after this machine came out. And yeah, I don't think that means it's going to work, does it? I mean, okay, yeah, I'm going to call that. A little bit sad that I've got my little notepad here to take notes about the speeds, and as we can see on here, 3.3 gigahertz. We didn't get to try that out, and we didn't get to try out the E7500 either. That doesn't work either. Okay, and now we have the E6700. I had this down as a Core 2 Duo. It is not, it is a Pentium. Honestly, I really don't understand what Intel was up to with their naming convention, because it's got the E very similar to the Core 2 Duos, but at the same time, it's not a Core 2 Duo, even though it's got multiple cores. I really don't understand what they were up to with that. Anyway, it came out in May 2010. I believe it has a 2 megabyte cache, and it runs at 3.2 gigahertz. So potentially one of the fastest chips that we have, if not the fastest, because it is not the fastest. We have a slightly faster chip in the 3.3 Core 2 Duo. So anyway, let's turn it on, see what happens. It is in. I've made sure that it's all seated nicely. And we're waiting for it to boot. I'm not seeing any booting, but I'm hearing the system fan getting quite loud. Okay, well, that didn't go very well. I've actually tried this already off camera, and I've tried it multiple times, and I can't get this particular chip to boot. So yeah, this, as I said, comes from May 2010, so it looks like it's not compatible with this logic board. So there we go. It's the Q6700 that we've actually gone with in the end. Bit of a surprise. I didn't expect at the sort of midpoint of this process where I bought these CPUs that would be the CPU that I would end up using. The common wisdom is out there is, it's better to go for a faster dual core chip. And that does make sense. But unfortunately, I didn't really do my homework, and I ended up buying some chips that obviously didn't work with this machine. So yeah, that was a little bit disappointing. Having said that, the silver lining at the end of the day is that we have a quad core chip, which isn't a bad thing. It'll make the machine more powerful overall, you know, having those extra cores to do extra tasks when we're playing games, especially if we play anything newer than the sort of era that, you know, this is really aimed at. In terms of an award, I don't know, I'm a little bit torn. You know, I've basically jumped through every single hoop. And I think right now I would probably have to award myself a silver award because it's not quite as fast as it could be. You know, 2.66 gigahertz is very fast, but it's not as fast as the Core 2 Duo that we saw earlier. What was it? 3.3 gigahertz. So yeah, that would be obviously substantially faster. It's about a 25% faster again. So yeah, I think it's fair to say, you know, a silver achievement is what we deserve at this point. But we do have one more thing that we can try to actually get this up to a gold medal, and that is a thing called the B-cell mod. So the B-cell mod was something that people worked out back in the day in the era of the Core 2 Duos and the quad cores. And it turns out that there's a pin on those chips that actually allows it to communicate with the logic board and for it to be told what the front side bus is that it should run at. Now, this machine runs at 1066, but if you block that pin, the chip will actually default to its fastest speed, which I believe is 1333 gigahertz. And that is 25% faster. So if we were to use that B-cell mod on this chip and it were to work, it would run at about 3.3 gigahertz. So yeah, that would be pretty amazing. And that would definitely be a gold medal, I think. So let's head over to the work area and I'll show you how we can actually make that mod. So let me show you very quickly on the bench here exactly what the mod involves. It's very, very simple, and there are quite a few web pages and also videos out there which show you how to do this. So I'm not going to go into this in a great depth. So this pin here, see there's a little nook here, which is one of the two orientation knocks in the chip. Well, this pin here, right next to it here, that needs to be covered in tape. So as an example, electrical tape is quite a good thing to use. Just cut off a piece of electrical tape, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter thick at its thickest really. That's what you want, something like that. And then you put that tape over here, over the pin, going towards the edge of the CPU. That's how I would do it. And then I would just cut off any excess with a pair of scissors or a scalpel. And that's basically it. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll go back over to the machine and we'll test out if this little trick works on this particular machine. So there we go. I've put the tape on that CPU, and all we can do is try. Let's give it a go. Okay, here's the CD-ROM going, the fan is spinning, and that basically always happens, so that's not really any sort of indicator. You can hear the fan spinning more quickly. I think that indicates that the CPU is basically not working. Because of that, it automatically, I think, goes into a protection mode where it ramps up the speed of the fan. So unfortunately, for some reason with that chip on this particular machine, that trick does not seem to work, not for me anyway. So I'll be interested to hear what people think about that. Now, I don't really want to delay the production of this video. Honestly, what I got out of it is actually pretty good. There is another quad-core CPU of this era, the Q6700. It's a little bit slower. It's 2.4 gigahertz instead of 2.66. But if you can get that to overclock, it will actually overclock to 3 gigahertz. So not exactly, 3.3 or 3.2 or anything like that, but 400 megahertz faster than this particular CPU. I bought so many CPUs, I don't really know if I want to buy any more, but I could. So I'll interrupt myself here because I actually did go ahead and order that CPU, the Q6600. It did take a few days to arrive, so it did actually delay the production of the video ever so slightly, but I thought it was worth it to be thorough, to make sure that I hadn't left, any stone unturned. And it arrived on Monday, and I put the tape over the pin, put it into the machine, turned it on, and yeah, the same thing. The fan started running away again. So unfortunately, it seems that it's something about this particular dimension, E520, that means that it just doesn't seem to work correctly with the B-cell mod. I don't know what it is exactly. I've seen people online saying that it does work on this machine, but I just couldn't get it working. So there we are. For us, overclocking on this machine using the B-cell mod just didn't work. So we're getting towards the end of our 5 super upgrades, and the last one that we want to look at is the cooler. Now, originally, I wasn't going to really focus on this as one of the big upgrades, but in fact, obviously it is. It does improve the potential performance of the CPU. And it would have been good if we could have overclocked the CPU to a higher clock rate, because that would have really put some stress on it. So what are the options? Well, actually, this was the cooler as it came with this machine, completely missing the aluminium heatsink that should have been there. So I had to buy a new one straight away. I got this as my first order. This is the actual cooler that would have come with this machine specifically. It's a big aluminium block, pretty heavy, I've got to admit. And you can see there, it's actually machined to fit onto the diagonally positioned CPU. And we're going to put this on now, and I'm going to do some benchmarks with it with 3D Mark and also with the CPU benchmark as well, just to see what we get out of it. The way I'm going to test this is I'm going to actually run 3D Mark 4 times, and I'm going to try and run it back to back. So basically we're going to try and build up the heat on this. And obviously this is going to use all of the cores on this quad core Q6700. And we'll see exactly what sort of performance we get with this. Do we get higher temperatures? Does it have to throttle the clocks? I'm not really sure it'll have to do that, but anyway, we'll give it a try. And then once we've done that, we'll put this one back in. So this is the heat pipe cooler. This actually came from, I think it was an Inspiron, I believe one of the higher end machines, more for business, I guess. And this had a better cooler on it. This one has a copper base. You can see I've still got the thermal grease on there. And then it has copper pipes here that go all the way to the top and then fit into these sort of little pipes here. And then it has all of these aluminium fins here to dissipate the heat out horizontally. And it fills the entire airspace here. So you get really good airflow coming through on this. And it'll just be interesting to see what sort of delta we get between the aluminium block and the copper heat pipe. So let me put this back in the machine, and then I'll do some benchmarks and I'll come back and let you know exactly what we found. Okay, so the results are in, and it's interesting reading if we have a look at the graph here. So it needs a little bit of explanation. The reason why the aluminium run, on the aluminium heatsink looks a little bit better, to be honest, than the copper heatsink is because on that particular day, the ambient temperature here in the UK was a bit higher. It's September at the moment, and the weather was actually pretty decent when I did that original run. So the ambient temperature in here was about 22 degrees. And then on the day when I did the aluminium test, it was about 19 degrees. So that's a 3-degree difference. And that kind of explains why it appears at first that the aluminium heatsink did better than the copper heatsink. But what's really telling is, if you look at that delta number that I put underneath, the aluminium heatsink swings in 9 degrees during the running of the test, whilst the copper heatsink only swings by 2.5 degrees. So, we call that a delta. From the lowest temperature to the highest temperature on the aluminium heatsink, we got a swing of 9.25 degrees. And as I said, on the copper, only 2.5 degrees. So that's a big, big difference. So it does show that the copper heatsink is obviously much more capable. So I would say, honestly, that unless you actually thrash this machine, use it for, say, 3D rendering and then, have it flat out for a day on end, especially in a high temperature location, say, where the ambient temperature is 35 degrees, you're not going to really see that much of a difference between the two coolers, not today anyway. But if you're going to use it for light use, as I'm going to do, relatively light use, just sort of doing sort of retro noodling around, then I don't really think it makes that much of a difference. If you can find the copper heatsink and it's not that much more expensive, then I would say go for it. But other than that, I think the aluminium heatsink is perfectly fine. So anyway, on this occasion, I did manage to get the copper heatsink. I did want to try it out and see what difference it made. So I think we have to achieve ourselves the gold award for the cooler. So I'm pretty happy about that. But like I said, at the end of the day, it wouldn't make that much of a difference if it was the aluminium, which I would say is still good. So there we are. The cooler, we have a gold achievement. So we've come to the end of our journey, and how did we do with this machine? Well, I would say overall, really well, actually. I'm very, very happy with this machine, the way it's turned out. This pretty forlorn E520, when I found it on the side of the road, I must admit, even I wasn't that interested in it. And the main reason for that is because it looks really good for its age. It actually doesn't look like a retro computer. It's got this beautiful white side to the case, really nice metallic finish on it. It just looks, I think, really quite modern. Because of that, I just popped it under the table over there and I left it for quite a while, not really paying that much attention to it, because I have a lot of other retro machines in my cabin, which, well, basically much more retro. But when I did actually get interested in installing Temple of Elemental Evil, I realized I would probably need another machine. I already have a Windows XP machine. It's a little bit earlier. It's an actual AGP4X machine and a lot less memory, etc., than this machine. So I thought to myself, makes perfect sense actually to upgrade this machine and get it up to the point where it can play this game and also a number of other games. So what happened with this machine? Well, the hard disk, it's now an SSD, so it's way, way faster, cooler, quieter, has double the capacity of the original one. So that was definitely a gold. Then there was the RAM. Well, we've gone from half a gigabyte of RAM to 8 gigabytes of RAM. So we've got 16 times as much RAM as in this machine as we had originally. Not only that, but it's actually faster RAM at 800 megahertz as well. So that will have lifted the ceiling on the CPU, so when we overclock those later. The graphics card, as we saw earlier, we were forced in the end not to use the Asus 8800 GT. It turned out that physically just wasn't going to fit in this machine. So we had to look a little bit wider, and I was forced to buy another card, which actually was, I think, £30. So just under our budget limit. But that really was a silver lining to that particular cloud, because that card turned out to be much, much faster than the 8800 GT. So we got a gold for the graphics card as well. So the hard disk, the RAM, and the graphics card, we've all achieved gold on those. Next up came the CPU. This was much more of a mixed bag because I didn't really do my homework really before starting on working on this machine. I didn't realize how varied it was and the particular period that I had to look at, and I couldn't find a definitive list of CPUs that actually did work in this machine. So I ended up buying a mixed bag of CPUs, and as we saw in the end, the fastest one that we could actually fit in this machine was the Q6700. That turned out to be a great CPU, 2.66 gigahertz, really, really fast, 4 cores. That was a great CPU, but in the end, I didn't award myself gold for that particular aspect because I decided that there is potentially, well, there definitely is a faster CPU out there. It's called the Q6700, which would actually be the same speed as this, but there is also the Q6700, which is a 3 gigahertz part, and the X stands for extreme, and that means that it is designed to be overclockable, so it could actually be overclockable in this machine. But there was an issue. That chip, or those chips I should say, are available for about between £45 to £50 on eBay, and I just wasn't really willing to break my budget goal by going for those chips. If anybody would like to donate one to the channel, if anybody's got one out there that's going spare, which I doubt very much, let's face it, they're obviously in demand, then I would be really happy to put it in this machine and try it out and see if it overclocked, because it would be fantastic to try out the cooler. Now, the cooler, as we saw, I awarded myself gold because we ended up going for the copper heat pipe cooler for this machine, which was, as far as I understand it, the best cooler you could get. So it had to be gold for that as well. So moving on from those 5 original goals, what about effectively the 6th goal, the budget goal? Well, I'm going to award myself gold for that. And the reason for that was because I showed restraint with the CPU. As I said earlier, I could have gone for the QX6700 or QX6800, but I just thought that it wasn't really worth it because it's a lot of money for a CPU that only gets you a few extra megahertz when potentially it won't actually overclock in this machine. We didn't get any of the CPUs which people said were overclock to actually overclock in this machine. I followed the guides, I did the B-cell mod on 2 separate chips. It just didn't work. The machine wouldn't boot. So I don't know what it is about this particular machine, why the B-cell mod won't work on it, but it didn't work for me. I've read online there is a piece of software that you can get for laptops which will unlock the front side bus in software. But I tried it on this machine and I didn't find it worked. Not that I could see, but it could be because it didn't have the right type of CPU in it. So it could be that with a QX6700 or 6800 it would actually work, but I wasn't willing to go for that. So in the end, the budget award is gold because I actually did stick to my budget. So the result is that we have this fantastic machine. It's way better than it was originally. Every aspect of this machine is faster than it was originally. So it's perfect now to install Temple of Elemental Evil and indeed other games from this era. I'm thinking about games like BioShock, also Fallout 3. Fallout 3 for me was a seminal game. I hadn't actually played Fallout until I actually played Fallout 3, and I know it was very influential on so many people, the first 3D Fallout game. So there are so many games from that era that are fantastic, and this machine is going to be perfect for playing those games. So I think what I'll do now is we'll finish off this video by installing Temple of Elemental Evil, and maybe in a following video we'll actually then play the game and see what it actually turns out to be like. So I hope you join me then, but until then, take care and have a good day.